Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Ex-Husband Haunting by Elena G. This story is true. Not one item about it has been changed or exaggerated. I'm relating it exactly as it occurred to me. Due to a paranormal experience that happened to me about 5 years ago, I spent 2 years as an apprentice to a psychic. What do you think, we're all born this way? I'm really a normal person, other than this particular eccentricity. I work in medical research, and I'm actually quite happy at it. But that's another story. If anyone ever wants to hear about it, the apprenticeship that is, I'd be glad to share it. It seemed like frequently that whenever we would have a lecture in class on a particular topic, I would have a practical problem presented to me through no effort on my part, and very little option available to me as to whether I wanted to turn it down. It was almost like having a laboratory to the lecture, only in metaphysics. It was very weird. We had a lecture on ghosts, entities as they're known in the trade, and what to do about them. I remember being buggy and disinterested in class, thinking that I would never have a practical use for that stuff. I just figured nobody got haunted anymore. But I came to find out very differently that very weekend. That Friday I had taken off from work as a vacation day, intending actually just to hang out and do nothing. An older friend of mine dropped by and off the cuff asked me out to dinner. During dinner, he mentioned that he would like to visit his daughter and her family, who lived in an older section of Detroit. He mentioned that his daughter had since remarried, but that she had had a bad time the last 2 years. Apparently, her first husband, David, had become increasingly mentally unstable, with the usual scenario of threats, physical abuse, kidnapping the kids, the whole 9 yards. He sounded like a fun guy, and she finally managed to divorce him. But as you can guess, that only escalated the situation. His enduring fixation was his son, who was then turning 3 years old. Attempts to kidnap him and or threaten to kill the child and himself were things they had to deal with every day. Police and injunctions proved irrelevant, and he was finally diagnosed schizophrenic and hospitalized a number of times. There wasn't anything that had much effect on him. The whole thing finally culminated in his breaking into their house one day while they weren't there. They were supposed to be, of course, but he put a .44 Magnum in his mouth and pulled the trigger. End of his story. Or so I thought. When we arrived at the house, it was in an uproar. The house itself was one of those huge houses they used to build in the suburbs of big cities that was so big that it had been split into a duplex. Nothing particularly creepy, just lots of wood, cabinet space, 2 floors, and an attic, probably built in the 1920s. The next-door neighbor had just that morning left the house in her night clothes. She left all of her belongings, including her kids, inside the house, and absolutely refused to go back. She left her kids? It sounded like her elevator didn't go all the way up to the top with that one, I thought. She said she'd seen a blonde, longish-haired man at the top of her stairs. The main problem, however, was that he had a hole in his head. A big hole, with his eyes all sunken back and what looked like blood all over him. Apparently, that hadn't been the only occurrence, just only the last in a long list of incidences. The little boy claimed to have seen his father a number of times next to his bed, and always at night. Things around the house had been broken as if thrown, and worse still, small fires had broken out under mysterious circumstances. In one instance, a portrait of Elvis had been torn off the wall and thrown across the room, shattering the glass and leaving holes in the wall. Apparently, this woman's ex had been incredibly jealous, but I couldn't say I blamed him on that one. The family was in a panic. They were planning to move, but couldn't move yet. I would have been out of there so fast I would have broken records. The woman actually called the church for help, but the Catholic priest the daughter called just laughed at her when she said she needed an exorcist and hung up on her. Suspecting what was going on, the daughter had taken a picture of David to the neighbor who was at a hotel. The woman went into hysterics and had to be taken to the ER and sedated. It was the same man, of course, just without the ventilation job he'd done on his head. She asked me if somehow I knew of anyone who could remove this whatever it was. For Pete's sake, I thought. Somebody up there really has a sense of humor. I told her, well, yes, fully intending to recommend her to my teacher. I really had no intention of getting involved with it. I was just a student, and this wasn't my specialty anyway. It sounded to me like this guy was dead serious, I'm sorry for the pun, and far more powerful than I wanted to mess with. My teacher had impressed that on us. You'd better know what you're doing and be completely confident in your abilities before you dive into anything. I wasn't convinced that I was either of those. I was about to give the woman my teacher's card when she told me that there had been further complications. Her little boy had come to her after a nap that afternoon in hysterics, bleeding from the mouth and gums. He gave a garbled story about his father wanting him to go with him, and the child refused to go back in his room for any reason. He showed the most sense I'd seen in the family yet. That did it. I reasoned that if this guy, this asshole, had that much balls, then there was no accounting for what he might do between now and the time my teacher could get there. So I was sort of beholden to do something right then. I remember thinking, this is just great. I'm shaking just remembering this happening, so bear with me. One of my strongest abilities lies in feeling or sensing the presence of spiritual entities. It's kind of like passing a magnet through iron filings. I kind of get oriented towards it, so I know I'd be able to locate this guy. And the big question was, though, of course, his removal. The power to do these things exists in the mind, which can be as powerful or as weak as you tell it to be. Building up the energy and keeping it pumped up can be difficult, and I had never applied it to this kind of problem before. However, the thought of that little boy being harmed forced me to try. The trick is this. Essentially, what you do is try to make it uncomfortable for the entity to continue living in a place, and then persuade it to go to the light. At that point, it has to make its own choice as whether it should go across or whether it wants to stay where it is. Sometimes, these people just don't know they're dead. Other times, they're so bound to unfinished business that they stay to finish it, seemingly like this guy was. The fact that this guy was severely mentally disturbed when he died didn't help my confidence levels any. The first thing we did was have a prayer vigil in the kitchen, while I went around and mentally covered everything with ultraviolet light. This is God's color, and He is the light, so nothing can penetrate such a shield. I covered everything. The house and family, the pets, the appliances, their cars, everything. We then went down to the basement, which was open to both apartments, and we blessed all the doors and windows, all of them with olive oil in Jesus' name. Whether you believe in Him or not, He was one extremely spiritually powerful person, and negative entities don't like Him. They can't stand Him. So we went through the entire house, both sides, laboriously blessing every door, window, and mirror in the house, and all the while I was building up the energy to make the place as light-filled as possible. The place seemed cool to me in the basement, even though it was kind of old and creepy. But as we went farther and farther upstairs, I started feeling more and more aware of the energy being pulled into the attic. I knew where he was, and he definitely knew where I was, and that I was coming to get him. I was fervently hoping he'd split before I got there. But the thought of that little boy really forced me to stay with it. How can you tell this without sounding crazy? I'd come to the conclusion that I'd come there that day for a reason and to just go with things. The sense of presence was strongest, of course, in the little boy's room, which had a trapdoor in the ceiling up to the attic. The whole front of my body was tingling, particularly my face and nose. I could palpably sense the misery, hatred, and insanity coming from just above me. How I managed to get up there and that trapdoor open, I have no idea. I was running on adrenaline, but at the same time I wasn't really frightened. I'd gathered my guides and angels around so tightly I think I nearly glowed in the dark. At that point, I honestly think I really was in an altered state. Something fell or flew from somewhere and landed at my feet. It was a headless, naked child's doll. I remember thinking coolly, oh, how cliché. At another level, I was wondering how I had gotten myself into this. In the corner, it was absolute blackness, and what I was looking for. This I knew. Someone began speaking, and after a second I realized it was me. Now, David, you know that you really have no place here. You're dead, and your family needs to go on with their lives, particularly your little boy. Let go, David. I know you're miserable. Let go and go to the light. There is peace there. Wouldn't you like that? My guides and angels are here to take you there. Go with them. This house is completely protected now, everything, and I'm sure it's very uncomfortable for you. If you don't go, you know who I'll invoke, so go with the guides now. Ultimately, my feeling for this poor lost soul was one of pity, and I can't express to you the level of misery and pain existed in it. And suddenly I got a sense of release of tension, almost like a wind blowing, and the room became somehow less menacing, less dark. I stayed there for a minute longer, just until I was sure I wouldn't fall down the ladder trying to get down. And then my analytical mind kicked in and responded by wanting to pass out. When I got back down, I told the family that he was gone, but they would have to believe that he was gone and reinforce that daily, or all my light work would disintegrate, and he would come back. That's the thing about this kind of work. If they don't go to the light, and you don't reinforce your shields, they can come back. They haven't had any other problems in that house for quite some time, although I had heard from a friend later that David did come back. So, apparently he still has not found peace. The next-door neighbor? She never set foot in that house again. So, there you are. Sometimes I wonder if it actually happened. And uncomfortably, the answer is always the same. Other strange things have happened to me as a psychic student. The thing is, I'm not even half trained yet. It makes me wonder what's next. The Things You See in the Woods by Mr. Redmond. First of all, let me start off by saying that this story is from almost 30 years ago when I was a kid. I've told very few people the story due to not feeling like anyone would believe me. Like a lot of kids in the 90s, I was hanging out over a weekend with a close friend of mine and staying at his house with him and his family. We lived in rural Virginia, and he lived in a small town like I did. We spent a lot of time riding four-wheelers and exploring the nearby woods that were across a soybean field. One weekend, I was visiting, and it had snowed an average amount for Virginia, 4 to 6 inches or so. We were beyond excited to take the four-wheelers out to the field and tear it up a little bit, and after we were bored of that, we parked at the edge of the woods and walked in a ways. Now, we'd been in the woods quite a bit, and had seen a lot of things. There was a lot of old equipment and even old rusted-out cars spread throughout an area of the forest. Being teenagers, we thought this was really cool and would often go check those out. That day, we decided that we were going to start building a fort of sorts back near the debris. I often carried a small hatchet on me when we were riding trails in case a smaller tree had fallen across the trail. I walked back to the four-wheeler and got it, and started to chop down a smaller tree to use as the base of a wall. For the life of me, I could not find another tree of the right size after that one was placed, so I started walking around the area without my friend. It was then that I stumbled upon a rotting deer carcass. That didn't bother me, growing up in rural Virginia. Friends and family were hunters, and I had eaten my fair share of venison in my life. However, I noticed that the deer had what appeared to be claw marks on it. Was this prey for another animal that didn't stick around for its meal? And what kind of animal could catch a deer out in this forest? I went to get my friend to show him the carcass, and he was as puzzled as me. Well, we just kind of let it be. I returned to building our fort, and as I was using some rope to tie two of the smaller trees together, something caught my eye about 50 yards away. What I saw was just the silhouette of a person. However, it was rounded off and blurry, almost like what you would see in a comic book or video game indicating an unknown character. Startled, I simply yelled, "Hey!" at it. It was then that it darted behind a tree, and I was now acutely aware that we were not alone. I yelled for my friend, and he came walking over. I let him know what I had just seen, and he laughed it off. But as he was laughing, I stood up from my squatting position and saw the same shadow over his shoulder no more than 10 yards away. I screamed, "Oh shit!" and immediately took off running for the field as I yelled at my friend to follow. I heard him following me and his footsteps growing closer, but then I heard his footsteps going farther away. I turned and looked, and he had split off onto a different path, and at that point I really didn't care, and just kept running as I reached a large ditch that was roughly 5 feet or so deep. I just jumped across it in a panic, and I later discovered how far of a jump that was, and have no idea how I cleared it. As I reached the field and got out of the woods, I saw my friend standing about 30 yards down the line of them, hunched over and breathing heavily. I checked behind me and saw nothing, and I started to walk towards him and asked, "You saw that, right?" To which he responded, "Why do you think I'm out of breath?" We jumped on the four-wheelers and headed back towards his house, not saying a word. When we got back, I asked him what he saw, because I wanted to know if it was the same thing that I saw. He described it perfectly, and we tried to talk to his parents about it, but they both just laughed it off and said, "Guess you better stay out of those woods." He had the idea to go talk to his grandmother, who lived a couple of blocks away and had lived in town her whole life. We asked her if she had ever heard anything strange about the woods over there. She then began to tell us about an old sawmill that had exploded back in her time. She said how much of a tragedy it was, and that nearly everyone had lost their life. That explained the old equipment. It explained the old cars rusting out. They had cleaned up parts of the accidents, likely the dangerous ones, and just left the rest. We then told her our story, to which she just smiled and told us how people don't realize that we aren't alone in this world. Absolutely horrified at that point, we left. Neither one of us ever returned to those woods. My hand axe is still sitting back there somewhere. I had terrible dreams for years about the incident, and still, 30-ish years later, have a random dream about the incident from time to time. I don't know what we ran into that day, but I'm certainly not going back to check. Parking lot incident by Anonymous. A few nights ago, I'd gotten up in the middle of the night to get some water after waking up coughing. As I walked into the kitchen, I saw the time on the microwave, and it was around 2 a.m. As I poured water into my glass, I heard car doors slamming outside the front room window. I live on the first floor of an apartment building near the main entrance. As I walked back to my bedroom, and just out of curiosity, and I'm still not sure why I looked since I'm not a really nosy person, I looked out from behind the curtain and saw a silver sedan with its lights off, but running, just sitting at the front steps to the main entrance of the apartment building. 2 women had just gotten out of the car and were talking to the person behind the wheel through the still open front passenger side door. I didn't have the window open, so I really couldn't hear them. The 2 women looked about middle-aged, both dressed in black coats and black dresses that went to just below their knees. They had dark shoes on and both wore beret-like hats. The strange part was they both wore sunglasses, and it was the middle of the night, on an overcast and drizzly night at that. The only light came from the light above the doors of the entrance to the lobby area of the building. And I also found it strange that there was no light on inside of the car because normally the interior light goes on when you open your car doors. But I guess maybe it just wasn't working. After about 5 minutes, one of the women walked into the apartment building, and I could hear her walking down the short flight of stairs to my level, and then trying to open the door to the hallway just outside the door of my apartment. You'd need a key to open it. She tried pulling on it a couple of times, and then I heard her walking back up the flight of stairs and go back outside to the car and her companions. By that time, the other woman was back in the front seat of the car, and I couldn't make out the driver at any time. I saw the woman open the door to the back seat behind the woman in the front seat, and before she got into the car, I saw her gaze more directly towards where I was standing, hidden behind the curtains. I couldn't tell if she was actually looking at me, because she had the dark sunglasses on, but it felt like it, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up for some reason. As she got into the car, strangely, I noticed the body of the car noticeably drop slightly, as if something extremely heavy was being put into the car. But it was just the woman getting in and slamming the door behind her. The car sat there for another few moments, and I could barely make out the 3 figures in the car, but they appeared to be completely motionless. Then, suddenly causing me to jump slightly, the car pulled forward and drove slowly out of the parking lot without turning the lights on. The car paused again for a moment before pulling onto the empty street. Then it turned left slowly and then just drove off down the street. Again, I'm not sure that there's anything paranormal or scary about this incident, but it definitely didn't feel all that normal to me either. It left me feeling a bit weirded out. It took me a while before I was able to fall back asleep that night. Secret Possession in the Family by Skylar. Growing up, I heard stories about how my mom was a little odd for a few years when she was a kid. These stories were always short and intriguing, but extremely mysterious to me. I would be told a story one day, and the next day they would say it was never true. However, over the years, I felt like I found so much evidence that it's hard to believe there isn't some sort of truth behind it all. My grandma said when my mom was around 4 or 5, she would have these spells where she would sit, legs straight out, with her back facing this mirror that was built into their trailer at the time, and just blankly stare into the distance. She said she would go up to my mom and shake her, and yell at her, literally anything she could do to get my mom back to reality. But she said she would just stare back. She always described it as my mom looking through you instead of looking at you. Obviously, as parents, their first concern was that she was having seizures or some sort of neurological condition, so they allegedly took her to the doctor to get some scans done. My grandpa would tell me that my grandma was crazy and liked to exaggerate stories. But about 3 years ago, I found a Polaroid in my grandparents' basement of my mom, the same age as the story, lying on a hospital bed with wires hooked up to her head. I asked my grandma about it, whose memory isn't always the best, but she tries. And she said they must have cleared her because they never went back for that again. They went home, but the spells continued. A cousin of ours, who was about 5 years older than my mom, said she remembers her telling the other kids that she was scared of the monsters in the mirror. My mom's older brother remembered sitting next to her and holding her hand while she would have those episodes. He said he wasn't afraid of her, but he was scared for her. I can't get many valid stories out of him, though. Every time I ask, he just describes the Exorcist movie. So many people that were around back then remember being freaked out by her, but no one could tell me exactly how or why they felt like that. Now, keep in mind, my mom remembers little to nothing about her childhood until about age 6 or 7, so I can't confirm any of this with her, or I would have. The story that truly made me believe that this might have been a possession of some sort was one day they were having Bible study in the living room, my mom included, when the radio came on, shouted, "Shut up," and turned right back off. This was not a time of Siri and Alexa where people could fake their way into scaring people. This was the late 80s, and the family was poor. There were multiple people there, and I've had a lot of them tell me they fully remember it happening. My grandpa, he was always one of those tough guys with tattoos. You never see him cry, and he'd knock out anyone who came after his own. But something happened one day where he ran out of the house and left my mom there alone. He apparently ran to a neighbor's and said he wasn't going back in there by himself. In the 22 years I was blessed to spend with my grandpa, I had never seen him be afraid of anything. And he never told me what he saw, and it drives me insane that I'll never know what happened that day. I'm not exactly sure what the correlation was, but my mom was given a teddy bear once, and apparently all of this started happening after that. They ended up having a pastor come cleanse the house and the teddy bear, and everything came to an end with my mom after that. She was back to the normal little girl they had known and loved once again. I didn't know any of this until I was about 10, and of course I asked what they ended up doing with the bear. And I remember her pointing at my closet and saying, "It's up there." So casually, like I haven't been unknowingly sharing a space with her possessed bear my entire life. I was already very interested in the paranormal. I mean, I watched all the ghost shows. I thought Zach Baggins was the shit, and I knew I was connected with spirits in some way, somehow. When I found out about my mom, I became obsessed with figuring out what the hell was going on with her during her childhood. In the last 10 years, she has remembered a couple of reoccurring dreams she used to have. They aren't necessarily scary, but I find them unsettling. The first one, she said, she remembered being on a hospital bed with a bunch of people surrounding her. She described her skin as being the texture of a bagel, and the people around her would continuously poke her with needles. The second dream, she remembered just sitting with her arms crossed humming. Not a song, just a flat tone, and rocking back and forth intensely. And that was it. Flash forward to my teenager and adult years. I had had more paranormal experiences than almost anyone I'd ever met. And I'm talking everything from little knocks to mimic encounters. I can't help but wonder if somehow this is all connected. Or maybe the things that have happened to me are a result of what happened to my mom. I'm so confused about it all, and I've been trying to connect the dots for years, but there's so much to unpack. Funny story. Last night my mom and I were setting up for a yard sale, and we had a special guest make a surprise appearance. The bear. Tonight, my mom had a little bit of an accident and ended up cutting her foot pretty badly, resulting in blood all over the floor. I mean, probably not related. But isn't that a weird coincidence, the day after finding the bear? I'm going to bring the bear back to my house and keep tabs on it for a little while. This origin story about my mom's possession constantly runs circles around my head, and sometimes I feel like I'm Dalton from Insidious. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening to my TED Talk. I hope you have a wonderful and spooky day. Werewolf in Colorado, submitted by Anonymous. I'm from Colorado Springs, Colorado. And this story happened to me when I was about 13 years old, and I'm 23 now, so 10 years ago. One evening, my brother, his friend, and I decided to drive up to this area that has a cool view of the city, and it's right next to a church. The area is more developed now, but back then the area to the east of the church was the foothills, with only one house built there about a half-mile east of the church. The church itself overlooks the city and the Rocky Mountains, of course. It's built on a foothill, and below the hill is a neighborhood, as well to the immediate south, north, and west of the church are neighborhoods, no more than a quarter of a mile away in each direction, except east. The overlook is looking towards the southwest. Anyway, the area is somewhere we'd gone before with friends because the overlook to the southwest before the neighborhood begins is an area that's very shrubby and rocky. We'd go exploring down there and hang out in this cave-type area. We were kind of bored teenagers. But on this night, my brother, his girlfriend, and I decided to just go park up there and enjoy the view and hang out. We'd only been there maybe a few minutes, and I decided to get out and have a cigarette. I got out and walked to the back of my brother's car, and then turned back toward the view. Something caught my eye to the right of the car. There was something there, about 15 or 20 feet from his car, and it was moving towards it. It looked like a huge black dog, but blacker than the night because I could see its outline. It was like the size of a wolf, but much thicker. I got scared because it was only about 25 feet away from me. I took a lighter out of my pocket and started to flick it, thinking maybe I'd scare it away, and this all happened in about 20 seconds. But then, as this thing was moving or walking, it morphed up into a human shape. I was standing there scared, like, what the hell is this? When I heard a voice behind me say, "Hey, you're not allowed to be up here. You need to leave." 2 men from the church were walking over to us. I guess they had problems with people hanging out up there. And anyway, when I looked back, the thing wasn't there. I got back in my brother's car and we left. Another one of the times we were hanging out in that area near the lookout, down in the shrubs and stuff, my best friend saw something. We were playing hide-and-seek at night up there with about 5 or 7 of us, and we were walking through a bunch of scrub oak, and my best friend, who was in front of me, stopped walking and froze. She said that standing in front of her was what she could only describe as a werewolf. She always saw things. I rarely saw them, but more so felt them. But anyway, I always wondered if what she saw and what I saw were somehow connected. I don't really know if werewolves exist, but we both saw something strange out there in Colorado. Church Stones by Rachel H. My ancestors are Romani on my mother's side, and I suppose that may explain why I've always had this sensitivity. I've had many experiences of the supernatural, and I'm used to it now, and I do accept it's a part of me. It was Christmas in the late 70s, 78 as I recall, and I was 10 years old. My father was a builder, and he saw an advertisement in the Manchester paper about a 200-year-old church about to be demolished. The natural stone was for sale. My mother had been hinting at one of those fireplaces with a minibar for our living room, which was very in vogue then. So he procured the stone and set about building it. The first night after it was finished, my mother was awoken by a noise that sounded quite low-key, with many voices speaking, and indeed singing in what appeared to be a foreign language. She told me she looked at the bedside clock, and it was a little after midnight. Thinking that one of us had left the TV or the radio on, she proceeded to go downstairs, and at the bottom of the stairs she realized that the voices were speaking and singing in Latin. My mother knew that, having been brought up in a convent in Ireland. Although quite frightened, she opened the door, and the voices, which by now were reaching a crescendo, abruptly stopped. There was no TV or radio left on. My mother recalls that, in her words, the room was as cold as a morgue, and feeling understandably shaken up. She ran up the stairs, and on passing my bedroom, I was to be heard shouting in my sleep, in Latin, which being brought up in Salford, I couldn't possibly have any knowledge of. My mother came in to comfort me, and that scenario proceeded to occur for another week. I became ill and told my mother and father I was having terrible nightmares about 2 sets of people in hooded cloaks, pulling me from one end of the living room to the other. I'd always been a lively child, and the change in my personality suddenly became significant. The local parish priest was called for, and he was under the impression I was speaking in tongues, and he immediately blessed the house, and those things never happened again. Perhaps what we were experiencing were lost souls, and they just needed some guidance. I like to think they're now at peace. It was only the beginning of my encounters with the other side, but I find a certain serenity from it all. It's nice to know there's something more, don't you think? Mapleton Mountain by Ozgirl. The spookiest place I've ever lived was in a tiny place called Mapleton Mountain. I was around 20. There were heaps of strange things that happened to me there, but as there is too much to tell all at once, so I'll just focus on the accident we had coming down off the mountain to Nambour. We, my boyfriend, our friend, and myself, went in our friend's two-door UC Torana, as we weren't too keen on taking the Valiant anymore after another weird incident that happened in it previously. At this time, there were another 2 cars on the road, one in front of us and one behind. All of a sudden, the car lost all control. The steering didn't work and the brakes didn't work, and we were coming on to a 30 kilometers per hour bend. We hit the embankment, and we all had our hands in front of our face because we were about to go through a giant wall of dirt. The dirt wall disappeared on impact, and the brakes suddenly kicked back in. We stopped right on the verge of the cliff, for want of a better word. I'd been sitting behind my boyfriend, and we both looked over onto the ground. One wheel was over the edge of the cliff, but we had stopped. No sooner than we'd breathed a sigh of relief, the car toppled down the side, rolling over and over, 9 times in total, and hit every rock on the way down. I remember sitting right back in my seat and watching glass from the side windows fly past in both directions, and hoping upon hope that none of it would hit me. But I didn't see the beam of wood our friend was using to hold down the spare tire flying for my head. Luckily, our friend did, else I wouldn't be here today. But anyway, we came to a stop at the bottom, and we all rushed back up to the lantana to the side of the road, half expecting the car to blow up. It took a while for me to figure out how to get out because I was dizzy and in the back seat of a 2-door car that was sitting on its roof. But I did notice that none of the windows were missing. The glass was still in place, cracked and smashed, but it had been held there by the tint. I still to this day don't know why I saw glass flying past me. The car behind us had stopped, but not the one in front. When we got to the top of the embankment, we told the man from the car behind what had happened, and he said that he had lost his brakes and steering too. Not only that, but he saw the wall of dirt rise up out of nowhere and go again. And then he told us that after we had stopped on the verge, he saw the whole back end of the Torana get lifted and thrown over the edge. We ended up seeing the man from the car in front of us the next day, and he too said he lost his brakes and steering. He said he tried to stop when he saw us go over the edge, but he couldn't because something had control of his car. Whenever we went to the pub after that, everyone would clear out. They thought we were ghosts, which I still find funny. Apparently, no one's ever survived going over Mapleton Mountain before, but I can't vouch for that. We found out later on that might have been a ghostly reenactment of a previous car race years before between 2 teenage boys. The boy in front didn't see his friend go over the edge and roll over the cliff to his death, But why we lived when that boy died? I don't know. Incidentally, the date of that day was Friday the 13th of January, 1995. My Creepy True Craigslist Roommate Experience by Just an Average Jess. Trigger warning. I speak briefly about past abuse, and the roommate experience contains sexual elements. Okay, so I found a room to rent on Craigslist. This was about 15 years ago, when it was still, kind of safe. When I met the gentleman who owned the home, I made it very clear I was just looking for a safe room to rent, and that I was not interested in a relationship of any kind. I'd also brought my mother with me for safety, and I needed to find a place pretty quickly, so I moved in the next day. Everything seemed fine for the first week or so. It was clean, there were no other roommates, and we seemed to get along well. But then he started to act kind of strange. I also started to find weird things around the home that I hadn't noticed at first. Don't worry, I'll be getting into all that in a second. He did have a seizure disorder, but that would only leave him temporarily unable to speak for about 10 seconds. He could still move around and operate a vehicle, etc. The seizure didn't make him convulse, he just appeared dazed for a few minutes. I chalked up the slightly erratic behavior to just a symptom of the seizures that he had. Unfortunately, I had been raped by a man 6 months prior to moving into this house, so I was beginning to exhibit symptoms of PTSD, but I felt safe around the man. He didn't go out of his way to try to make me feel safe, and I, just for some reason though, felt like I could trust him. He didn't end up forcing himself on me, so if that's a trigger for anybody, it doesn't get like that. There is a reason I bring this up, but it's for a slightly more innocent reason. One day, he began telling me about the last girl that had lived there, and he decided to tell me that he would pay her for sex, or I think he would charge less rent. I don't remember the specifics, but it was definitely not legal. I told him that I was very upset about that because I made it very clear that I was not looking for anything sexual or any kind of relationship. He didn't know about the attack that had happened to me, but I was still very angry because he had sworn up and down he wasn't looking for anything like that, and he really just needed help paying the bills. For the next month or so, I just avoided him as much as possible, and occasionally he would bring up weird little sexual things, and then apologize. He did have a traumatic brain injury, which is also why he had seizures. I still don't know to this day if he was lying about all of that or what was going on, but I didn't really get upset and start screaming at him if he literally didn't remember what he had just said. I would just once again reiterate that I would need to move out in a month. I was renting month to month, and that was if he continued bringing it up. He then asked if I wanted to play with him to get half of my rent discounted. I declined and reiterated that I was not interested. And then a day that I will never forget happened. I was smoking a cigarette in the backyard and noticed that there was a tool shed that I hadn't really paid any attention to. Well, that day I was bored, and I decided to just peek inside. I found some strange-looking tools and thought nothing of it, and then later found out they were antique gynecological tools. Yeah, you heard that right. Naturally, I thought this man was committing horrific crimes in his backyard, but when I spoke to him about it, he said it was just a weird fetish collection of his. They actually were quite dusty and seemed to be in an undisturbed area. But then, the next day, he'd gone to work and had left his bedroom door open, that he normally left shut. I happened to notice that there was a cage with a mannequin inside of it. It was like a BDSM brothel in there. He had whips, flogs, sex toys, and even this weird thing that trapped your arms. I actually began documenting things with my phone, taking pictures, and sent them immediately to my mom and sister. I was starting to fear for my safety at that point. Again, since there were no bodies or anything like that, I figured I would be okay to spend the night there until my mom could get me the next day, as she had to drive down from out of state. When my roommate got home from work, he went to his bedroom for a moment, then came out and said, "I saw that you were taking pictures." Then he said, "I love the way you wash your hair and dry off in your bedroom." If you're a landlord, you can have cameras that are in common areas and are very visible. But apparently, he had hidden cameras everywhere. He definitely had one in my bathroom, and he had a few in my bedroom as well. I literally ran outside and called my mom. My mom said hang up and call 911 right then, and that's what I did. Unfortunately, there wasn't much that they could do. I believe that he removed the cameras as the police were on the way because they didn't find any camera or footage. They said that, yeah, the cage thing was weird, and the tools were weird, but there was no evidence of crimes or anything. At that point, I was extremely terrified, especially because of what had happened to me earlier that year. My mom was scared for me as well, so she and my dad got me a hotel room, and I stayed there that night until they could get there the next day. I requested a police escort the next day, and although I did have to wait several hours, they came and helped me get my things out, and my mom and dad made sure to get me the hell out of there. Desert Creature, submitted by Anonymous. I was stationed at 29 Palms in the 70s, and one night a friend and I went driving in the desert towards Joshua Tree National Monument. We were just enjoying the cool night air, and we were having an animated conversation, when suddenly a loud and repeated knock hit the driver's side door. I thought perhaps I'd hit a small animal and its carcass was flung onto my door, so I pulled over and got out of the car to check. There was nothing there. No dead animal in the road, nothing. We got back in and continued driving, and a few miles down the road, the same noise hit the car door. But this time, it was on the passenger side. My friend began to get nervous, but I still thought it was car-related. Maybe I'd had a blowout and had been driving on a flat tire, which had lost tread. I stopped it again, checked all the tires and the doors. Nothing. I started driving again, and that's when the car just went dead right there in the road. The lights went off, and the car slowed until I stopped it out of fear, in the middle of the road. My friend and I just sat there frightened, and then, when the car started, the lights came on. It was a 1973 LTD. And there, crouched on the side of the road on the passenger side, was some kind of creature. It looked like a Hollywood movie creature, like a dog of some sorts with an oversized head like a howling werewolf. We both screamed and I hit the gas. This thing stood up on its hind legs and ran across the road. Almost 20 years later, I heard a biology professor mention something about cryptozoology, so I told him the story. He was a collector of folk tales, and he told me of the Nagual of the southwestern desert. I don't know what I saw, but my professor said such a creature has been reported many times. But I was very young back then, and the experience frightened me so badly that I never went night driving in the desert again. Footrace, submitted by Anonymous. I grew up in a very outdoor environment and spent a substantial amount of my time in and around the woods, day or night. I've lived in Washington my whole life, and I've had an interest in cryptozoology as a child, but I'd never taken any mention of Bigfoot seriously until I had my encounter. I was living at my parents' house that summer in 2009, and I spent many days visiting a friend who lived about 10 minutes away, if I walked there on foot on a trail. Winding my way up and downhill through the woods, I often looked down and noticed that the brush underfoot was consistently stamped flat. A lot of people might have been using it, but in all my time of living in that area, The only people I ever saw on it were myself and some of my friends who might have been taking that trip with me, back between our houses. Having spent that night, like many before and after, relaxing on my friend's patio with several other people, I got up, put out my cigarette, and said my goodbyes and left. I walked out of his driveway and got onto the trail. That night, it was moonless, so it was very, very dark. It was probably around 1 in the morning, and it was normal for me to not see any cars on my short trip back to the main road. As I was on the trail, it was very, very still, but the normal sounds were there for the nighttime. Insects, the occasional rustle off in the bushes of a small animal, nothing out of the ordinary. But it was almost pitch black because of the tree cover. I knew the trail like the back of my hand and walked confidently forward. And that's when it happened. Behind me, to my right, probably about 20 feet away, I heard movement in the brush and ferns. I didn't even realize I was hearing anything until it lasted more than a few seconds, and I realized it was moving in the same direction as me and breaking sizable tree branches underfoot. I stopped and listened, and after a second, the rustling came to a stop too. I could hear faint, slow, and deep breathing, like that of a large animal. It wasn't loud enough to be from exertion. It seemed natural, as if whatever was behind the lung capacity was big enough to encompass several of my breaths and one of its own. I waited for about a minute and didn't hear anything except the breathing, slow and even. I took another step and started down the trail again, and again something moved through the woods after me, keeping pace and tempo with my movements. And sure enough, I could hear ferns, ivy, blackberry bushes, and the like being pulled or pushed aside, and that slow breathing started again. I stopped again, and this went on for another 5 or so minutes before I reached the trailhead, scared out of my wits. I still hadn't heard any individual footsteps, hadn't seen or smelled anything, and I don't remember which way the wind was blowing, if there even was one. I decided that once I hit the tree line, I was making a run for it. So as I walked evenly up, this thing followed in the same way I had been for several previous minutes, and trusting my ears as a track runner, which I was fairly talented at, came to a stop and then bolted into a sprint down the hill. A moment later, whatever was following me decided to move as well. As I pounded down the hill towards the right turn back up to the street, this thing broke the trees from where I had, the gravel and then asphalt. Its breathing became a series of low growls, almost a series of calls that sounded hoarse and aggressive. It was loud enough to echo off the surrounding trees. But the moment it hit the gravel, I knew something was wrong. Of all the animals I've ever seen in their natural habitat, that are native to western Washington, none of them sounded like this. There was no lope, stride, or gallop that resembled how this thing sounded when it moved. One of the more intense memories I have of this incident was hearing that noise. Distinctive impact with the ground on not 4, but 2 feet, and the smacking of bare feet on asphalt when it hit the driveway. That was unsettling, to say the least. But then another thing happened to my dismay and confusion. Instead of following me down the driveway on the asphalt, it crossed over the asphalt and went into the woods to my right, diagonally away from me. My first sensation was relief, until I realized it had increased its speed drastically, and its calls rang out from the woods in my direction still. Rounding around the corner of a street to get up back to my street level where there were streetlights, I realized this thing was trying to cut me off by getting ahead of me, cutting through backyards of neighbors across the street from me. Realizing that, I got a huge adrenaline rush as I absorbed the severity of having this thing, whatever it was, between my house and me. Running as fast as I could, I cleared the hill and started running on the flat towards my driveway off the road a little farther down. At the same time, behind me, to my right, I heard this thing pound across a neighbor's grassy yard, heavy and distinct, single impacts of a two-legged animal. I had been able to beat it on the road, but I wasn't out of trouble yet. As I raced along the road, this thing crossed the yards, leapt a 10-foot ditch, and landed 4 feet below on the asphalt road behind me, all without stopping, tripping, or stumbling once. It kept on growling, calling at me, and I'm guessing from the time it took for it to reach the road from their backyard, I figured this thing couldn't have been moving any slower than 20 or 25 miles an hour. I'd been clocked at sprints of 22 miles an hour before, not including adrenaline. As this thing pounded after me, I heard once again the distinct sound of 2 individual feet contacting the ground. As I took a turn onto my driveway, my dog Gus, a purebred Airedale Terrier, started going nuts. I skidded around the corner a little short, not including my adrenaline. This thing pounded after me, and I heard it once again, that same sound. Distinct feet, 2 individuals contacting the ground. I skidded around the corner, shortly followed by my pursuer, and got to my house with Gus running up to meet me. He was in full sprint, legs outstretched, heckles up, and growling fiercely. And truth be told, he was a gentle giant. He only acted this way towards squirrels, coyotes, and raccoons. He must have seen what was after me, and it stopped him dead in his tracks. He went from a sprint to 0 in about 3 or 5 feet and started barking crazily. I stopped as I heard whatever this creature was also stopping, and I wheeled around to look back for the first time. Away from the streetlights on a moonless night with old pine and fir trees looming overhead, my eyes couldn't see a damn thing. But I did see the gravel it must have kicked up by coming to such a fast halt, land near my feet. I felt some of it bounce off my shoes and lower legs as I was turning around. All 3 of us were frozen in place for a single quiet moment. Gus was growling, hair raised, ready to defend me, and I was panting, standing straight and looking straight into the darkness. And whatever this creature was, it couldn't have been more than 15 feet in front of me, growling and breathing deeply, enough to raise the hair on the back of my neck again, even after being chased the way I was. Gus and I looked at each other at the same time, and I said, "Stay," with all the gravity I could muster in my voice. He looked back into the darkness and continued growling as I dashed to my garage, grabbed a hatchet, and ran back. I returned to the same scene. Gus and this thing were having a growl-off. I unsheathed the hatchet and stood ready, waiting, searching the blackness for any sign of this thing. But all I could hear was its breathing and the intense sensation that we were making eye contact. That this thing and I were holding each other with our eyes for several minutes. Then suddenly I heard crashing and rustling in the bushes moving away from me for a good 30 seconds. And Gus finally relaxed. We both went inside, and I didn't let him out at night for a week after that. And after dark, he'd sit by the windows and occasionally growl as if he'd seen something. He didn't even do that to any of the other animals he'd normally go on. And each time he did, I'd step outside and listen, and the woods would be filled with an unnatural quietness, a stillness. Since that night, I can confidently say that I was stalked, followed, and then chased by a Bigfoot that was then dissuaded by the presence of my dog and the light of the house so close by. Eight Toes by John W. My family on my mother's side were moonshiners. They lived in a long, dark hollow called Duncan Fork on Trace Creek of Mingo County, West Virginia. It was a large family. It consisted of my great-grandfather, his wife, and if I'm not mistaken, 12 or 14 of their offspring, along with the wives and husbands of the ones that were married. All or most of them lived in Duncan Fork and raised corn and sold moonshine to support the families. This was around the late 20s or early 30s. My grandmother said that most of the women would work the fields and watch for the law. There was always some of them on guard with rifles. She said everything started with one of my great-uncles seeing something while returning from making a delivery of shine. The deliveries were always made after dark, and while coming back across the mountain between Bias, West Virginia and Duncan Fork, he heard a loud scream, like something dying, or at least in great pain. When he stopped his wagon to see what it was, he saw a large, dark animal of some kind on the opposite side of the hill from him. He said it was not a bear or anything he'd ever seen before, and when it started to come across the little hollow towards him, he shot at it with his rifle. But it didn't seem to have any real effect. The thing just screamed and ran away. After that, this thing was seen many times in the following 2 years or so around Duncan Fork. It was shot at many times, but with no apparent effect. And everyone started calling it 8 toes, because where its tracks were found, they always had 8 toes. I can't remember if there were 8 on each foot or only on one. My grandmother told me about another time when my grandfather was bringing a load of sugar across the hill, and this thing suddenly jumped into the trail and swung a paw or arm or whatever at him. It missed, but he took off as fast as his horse would go, and when he got home that night, there were 4 deep cuts across his horse's side, and the 50-pound bag of sugar had been torn open. Grandpa said he'd shot at it with his pistol, but he didn't know if he'd hit it or not, because his horse had been jumping around, obviously scared. Grandma told him that the thing had been sent to punish them for the things they were doing. She said there had been 3 lawmen killed on Duncan Fork the day the thing had jumped my grandpa. There were many accounts of this thing getting after the men and tearing up their stills while they were either making moonshine or bringing stuff in to make it. But she said it never seemed to bother the women. One time, she and another woman were going to draw water from the well late at night, when this thing stood up behind the well. She said it was at least 7 to 8 feet tall, and it stood and walked away on 2 legs like a man. She said it was hard to tell what color it was, but she thought it was a dark brown. About 2 years after the thing was first seen, the law finally did get in to smash the stills in the head of the hollow, after killings on both sides. The thing wasn't seen after that. Maybe it was something sent by whoever to help stop all the things going on at the time in Duncan Fork. Who knows? Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature you'd like me to narrate, email it to UncleJoshTrueScaryStories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give it a thumbs up? If you're not subscribed, why not become a subscriber? And leave me a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. If you'd like to take your support of what I'm doing a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and get yourself some Uncle Josh or Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is down in that description too. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.